Night falls on Whitehall. The court sleeps, or pretends to. Behind velvet curtains, the air is thick with perfume and secrets. A fire sighs in its grate. Wax drips from a half-melted candle. And somewhere, beyond the echo of laughter and lute strings, a door closes softly. It is the 1520s, an age of silk and sin, of painted saints and living sinners. The Tudor court hums like a beehive of ambition, and love, or something wearing its disguise, is one of its most dangerous currencies. To share the king's bed is to touch the sun. To wake without his gaze is to fall back to earth. In these chambers, women are remembered not by birth, but by breath, by the way they speak his name in candlelight, or the way they learn to keep silent when the morning comes. Henry VIII, still young and golden, commands England as though it were his reflection. His court gleams with promise, painted ceilings, polished marble, the scent of imported oranges. But beneath that splendour lies something else, a quiet fever of desire and danger that will one day burn an empire. The king is 29. His queen, Catherine of Aragon, approaches 40. She has given him a daughter, Mary, but no surviving son. The courtiers whisper, the priests pretend not to hear. And in those whispers, a new kind of power begins to stir. Her name is Elizabeth, Bessie Blunt, a lady in waiting, fair-haired and laughing. She is clever enough to appear simple, beautiful enough to seem divine. The king calls her his blunt beauty, and in the shadow of that jest, she becomes something far more perilous, his mistress. For a time, their affair is cloaked in music and hunting parties. The courtiers pretend to be blind. The queen remains silent. In 1519, she bears him a son, Henry Fitzroy, and with that, her name is stitched forever into the tapestry of Tudor power. Fitzroy, son of the king, the first royal bastard to be publicly acknowledged in more than a century. He will be showered with titles, Duke of Richmond, Duke of Somerset, and his mother, though no longer the king's beloved, will taste the strange sweetness of survival. Yet the bed that lifts one woman destroys another. For in the Tudor court, desire is a ladder, narrow, gilded, and slick with tears. Before long, others will climb it. Mary Boleyn, whose laughter hides her peril, and Anne, her sister, the woman who will teach England how a whisper in the dark can change a crown. But that comes later. For now, the candle burns low, and somewhere behind the curtains the king dreams, not of God, nor of England, but of the woman who lies beside him. And as the night deepens, the walls of Whitehall listen. There were few things more valuable in Tudor England than proximity. To stand close to the king, to breathe the same perfumed air, to catch the warmth of his gaze, was to hold a kind of power that could not be written into any law. And yet, it was a power purchased dearly. The court was a theatre, dazzling and dangerous, where every smile was currency and every silence could be a weapon. Behind every jewelled sleeve, a whisper. Behind every bow, a calculation. Even the walls seemed to lean in, as though listening. By day the palace glittered. Courtiers moved through the galleries like exotic birds, men in slashed velvet doublets, their necks heavy with gold, women trailing silks that whispered secrets as they passed. The scent of oranges, imported from Seville, drifted through the halls, mingling with beeswax and ambition. But when night fell, something shifted. The laughter grew softer, the games more dangerous. The flicker of candlelight on polished marble seemed to blur the line between prayer and temptation. And at the heart of it all, the king, Henry, still in the bloom of his youth, golden-haired, magnificent, and insatiably aware of his own charm. He hunted by day and ruled by night, and in both pursuits he found pleasure in the chase. To be noticed by him was both an honour and a warning. To be loved, if that was what he called it, was to risk ruin disguised as glory. It was no secret that the Queen, Catherine of Aragon, had lost the favour she once held. She remained dutiful, regal, but her silence had become the sound of resignation. The courtiers pretended not to see it, but they did, and among them moved women who understood that affection could build an empire, or end one. Some were wives, others widows, a few barely out of childhood, but all of them learned to speak the language of the court, glances instead of words, laughter where tears would have been safer. And in this fragile balance of virtue and desire, a woman could rise higher in one night than most men could climb in a lifetime, if she played her hand well. It was in this glittering, perilous world that Elizabeth Blount, Bessie as they called her, began to move. Not as a schemer, not yet, but as a girl whose smile lit the king's table brighter than any candle. Her laughter floated down the corridors like a melody, sweet and disarming. She was not noble by birth, but she understood instinctively what so many courtiers did not, that charm was its own kind of lineage. And when the king's eyes found hers, across the noise, across the gold, across the crowd, the game, though she did not yet know it, had already begun. For in Tudor England, affection was not given. It was earned, traded, and spent, one glance at a time. It began as most Tudor romances did, not in the chapel or the council chamber, but on a hunt. The king loved the hunt above almost everything else. It was sport, yes, but also a kind of theatre. A pageant of control and conquest, played out beneath the open sky. He rode ahead of his men, his scarlet cloak blazing against the green of the English woods, his laughter carrying farther than the horns. And among the riders that day was Elizabeth Blount, cheeks flushed, hair caught by the wind, the picture of unstudied grace. She was no court strategist, not yet, but she had what few others possessed: ease. Where other women tried to please, she simply existed, bright, warm, unafraid to laugh in the king's presence. He noticed. It was not long before the banquets became smaller, the laughter a little more pointed. He would call for her to dance, to sing, and she did, her voice light as lace, threading through the air until the courtiers fell silent, each one pretending not to see the way his gaze lingered. Music was the court's most dangerous language. What could not be spoken could always be sung. Soon their glances began to stretch, from table to table, across the clink of goblets and the glow of wax. There was no declaration, no letter sealed in wax or gift of pearls, just a quiet, inevitable gravity that drew them toward each other. The Queen said nothing. Silence was, after all, the most loyal companion of a wounded heart. And in that silence, Bessie Blount became something more than charming. She became visible. The courtiers began to bow a little lower when she passed. Servants carried her words faster through the palace halls. She laughed easily, but she was not a fool. She had seen what affection could build, and what it could destroy. The Tudor court was a mirror, and every smile reflected back a little danger. Yet she walked its corridors unafraid, for in that moment, with the music soft, the candles bright, and the king's eyes fixed upon her, she believed she might just be the exception. And in Tudor England, that belief was the most seductive thing of all. By the spring of 1519, the consequences of affection had taken on a name: Henry Fitzroy, a son. Not a lawful heir, but a living symbol of what desire could create when blessed by a crown. For the first time in generations, a royal child born outside marriage was not concealed in quiet country walls, but raised in triumph. The boy was showered with titles: Duke of Richmond, Duke of Somerset, honours that spoke less of love and more of the king's pride. To some it was scandal, to others a promise, proof that the Tudor line could and would continue. And Bessie Blount, who had once been the brightest laughter in the royal hall, stepped away before that same brightness turned cruel. She left court with dignity, no banishment, no disgrace, only the quiet understanding that favour, like flame, cannot be held too long. Yet the court never stayed quiet for long. Even as Bessie's name softened into memory, new laughter rose from the king's chambers. Mary Boleyn, recently returned from France, quick to charm and quicker still to fall under the same golden spell. She was warm, open, unguarded, the sort of woman the court devoured with its eyes. The whispers began anew, one mistress fading into history as another stepped into her place. But this time there was another figure in the shadows, a sister who watched, learned, and waited. Anne. For if Mary's path was pleasure, Anne's would be precision. And in the glittering peril of Henry's court, precision would prove far more dangerous than love. When Mary Boleyn returned from France, she brought with her more than fine silk and foreign manners. She carried with her the scent of French roses and scandal, and the memory of a court far more dangerous than England's. She had seen kings amused, queens replaced, and women made legends for less than a smile. The French called it l'art de plaire, the art of pleasing, and Mary had learned it well. So when the King of England turned his gaze her way, she understood what was required. She laughed freely, spoke softly, and gave him her attention as if it were a gift. And for a while that was enough. The court glittered with her favour, feasts, hunts, dances, each moment gilded with the knowledge that her touch was now royal currency. But Mary's heart, though warm, was unguarded. Where Bessie had understood discretion, Mary offered devotion. And devotion at Henry's court was a dangerous luxury. Her beauty became common talk, her French ease mistaken for vanity. The whispers gathered like smoke. The king's new mistress. The sister of... what was her name again? Anne? Anne. Quiet, dark-eyed, waiting. She had returned from France too, though with something far rarer than charm, calculation. Where Mary sought affection, Anne studied advantage. She watched her sister's laughter fade into weariness, watched how quickly a king's affection could turn into absence. And she swore that when her turn came, it would not end that way. The court still called her modest then, the clever one, the quieter one. But Anne understood that modesty, in the right hands, could be as potent as desire. She played the waiting game as if she had invented it. A glance one day, a refusal the next. A smile that said not yet to a man unaccustomed to being denied. And in that single act of resistance, she became the most compelling woman in England. For nothing fascinated Henry more than what he could not immediately claim. What began as flirtation soon became obsession, the kind that rewrites kingdoms and ruins queens. the air at court thickened again, full of laughter that wasn't laughter, music that sounded like a warning. The Boleyn name, once ordinary, began to glimmer like a blade catching candlelight. And at the centre of it all, two sisters, standing in the same fire, each believing she could dance without burning. Anne Boleyn was not beautiful in the way her sister had been. Her allure lay elsewhere, in the tilt of her smile, the confidence in her silence, the way she carried intelligence like jewellery. Men at court called her clever, women called her dangerous. Both were right. She had learned much during her years in France, how to speak with charm, how to dress with precision, how to make restraint look like temptation. When she returned to England, she carried that knowledge like a weapon. The king noticed her first in the simplest of ways: a conversation at a masque, a dance half refused, a glance that lingered just a heartbeat too long. It was not love, not yet. It was fascination, the kind that unsettles powerful men because it reminds them of what they cannot command. Henry, accustomed to obedience, found her elusive. He sent gifts. She declined. He wrote letters. She delayed. And the longer she waited, the deeper he fell. At court, the whispers shifted once more. The king is writing. To whom? But Anne was cautious. She understood that the Queen, Catherine of Aragon, though ageing, still commanded respect, still had allies in the church and council. So Anne played her part carefully, never crossing the line into open defiance. She laughed when spoken to, curtsied when expected, and kept her secrets stitched beneath the pearls at her throat. It was said she carried herself as though she were already royal, and in a way she was. The king began to speak of her in metaphors, of falcons and trophies, of jewels that could not be bought. His letters, written in his own hand, became more fevered, more tender, more dangerous. "Mine own sweetheart," he wrote, "I wish I were in your arms, for I am yours, body and soul." The courtiers pretended not to notice, but they did. For every glance that passed between Anne and the king was a stone thrown into still water, and the ripples touched everyone. Old alliances began to shift. The Queen's supporters grew restless. The priests whispered of sin. And through it all, Anne smiled, calm, unreadable, the quiet architect of her own ascension. In a court where affection had ruined so many, she was building something far more lasting, a claim to power. She did not yet know what it would cost her, but then no one at court ever does. The court had always belonged to the Queen, to Catherine of Aragon, first in grace, first in loyalty. For nearly 2 decades, she had stood at Henry's side, through wars, stillbirths, and the slow erosion of her youth. She had been his conscience once, his anchor. But now, the centre of gravity had begun to shift. There were whispers, letters sent by private courier, glances that lingered too long, a new name carried in the breath of every chamber. Anne. The Queen heard them all, though none dared speak them aloud in her presence. She watched as courtiers bent their loyalties like reeds in the wind, bowing a little lower to the young woman with dark eyes and quiet resolve. Catherine was no fool. She knew the signs. A king distracted, invitations delayed, the music of laughter that no longer rose from her own table. Yet she met it with dignity, her silence sharper than any blade. For a queen's greatest weapon was not anger, it was composure. Still, even composure has its limits. Behind her prayers and her rosaries, there lived a steady ache, a private grief too old to cry over and too deep to name. And so, in the great hall of Whitehall Palace, the kingdom began to divide. Not in law or allegiance, but in gaze. One half still looked to the Queen, bound by duty. The other half turned toward the woman who might one day replace her. And at the centre of it all, the King, torn between faith and desire, crown and heart, God and himself. To Henry, Anne was not a passing fancy. She was something else entirely, an answer to a question he had not yet dared to ask aloud. What if God had not meant him to have Catherine? What if he had chosen another? In those quiet, perilous thoughts, the seeds of a revolution began to take root. Not in the streets, not in the council chambers, but here, in the hushed corners of a royal heart, where love and power first learned to speak the same language. The king had begun to change. What had once been a flirtation, bright and breathless, had taken on the gravity of purpose. Henry no longer spoke of songs or masks, but of legacy, of destiny. God, he said, has denied me a son for a reason. Those around him nodded, careful, calculating. For everyone at court understood what those words meant, the beginning of an ending. Queen Catherine had given him everything but what he desired most, a living heir. And now, his heart, and perhaps his conscience, had begun to wander toward the woman who had once only been a distraction. Anne. She had not asked for this power, but she understood it. To love a king was to love a storm, but to guide him was to shape the weather itself. She listened when he spoke of divine purpose, of Old Testament kings, of God's will and broken vows. She did not argue. She simply tilted her head, letting silence do what persuasion could not. And soon, the silence became scripture. The king began to believe that his union with Catherine was not sacred but cursed, that Anne's very presence was a sign not of sin, but of salvation. He began to seek counsel, to summon priests, bishops, scholars, all to answer one question. Can a man remain bound to a woman who was once his brother's wife? It was not just a theological question. It was a declaration of intent. In private, Anne read the same passages he quoted. Leviticus, Deuteronomy, her eyes tracing the words that might make her queen. The court watched in silence. The whispers grew into prayers, and prayers into factions. England was dividing, and no one yet knew into what. But in Anne's calm, deliberate gaze, Henry saw not rebellion, he saw destiny. And for the first time, the woman who had once waited became the woman for whom kingdoms would change. It began in triumph. In the summer of 1533, Anne Boleyn rode through the streets of London beneath a canopy of gold. The people lined the roads, some cheering, some silent, as the woman who had divided a kingdom became its queen. Catherine of Aragon was gone, exiled to silence and prayer. Rome had been defied, and in her place a new order was crowned, not just of blood, but of belief. For Anne's victory was not only of the heart, but of faith. She had helped give England a new church, a new conscience, a new king, unbound by any law but his own. The mistress had become the movement. Yet even in her moment of glory, the air was heavy with watching eyes. The courtiers who once bowed at her feet now measured their gestures. Her laughter was weighed, her words recorded. Power, Anne discovered, was not what one held, it was what others allowed you to keep. When her daughter Elizabeth was born, the king's joy was real, but fleeting. "A daughter," he said, "is better than none." And in that single sentence the first crack appeared. The same fire that had once made Anne irresistible now made her intolerable. She spoke too freely, ruled too boldly, loved too fiercely. The courtiers began to whisper again. The same lips that once praised her wit now condemned her pride. Henry grew restless, torn between admiration and exhaustion. For the king who once broke an empire for her now longed for peace. And peace had never lived easily beside passion. By the spring of 1536, the court was no longer hers. Jane Seymour waited quietly in the shadows, her humility a balm to the king's pride. When the charges came, treason, adultery, conspiracy, Anne faced them with the same poise she had once used to captivate. She denied nothing that mattered and everything that didn't. And when she met her end on a clear May morning, it was said she prayed not for vengeance, but for mercy. The mistress who had become a queen left behind no son, no army, no allies, only a daughter. But that daughter would one day rule longer, harder, and wiser than any man who came before her. In that, Anne's story did not end. It simply changed its name. For the flame that consumed her would light England for generations. The court did not mourn long. It never did. Grief, like loyalty, was a luxury reserved for those far from the throne. And so, even before the black cloth had been lifted from the chapel pews, another name began to rise in whispers. Jane Seymour. A lady of quiet manner and softer words. Where Anne had been brilliance, Jane was composure. Where Anne had commanded, Jane waited. Her gift was patience, the rarest virtue in Henry's court. She neither sought his gaze nor fled from it. She simply was, and that was enough. For a man who had torn his soul apart for love, there was comfort in her calm. He called her gentle. His courtiers called her safe. But Jane was neither naive nor passive. She had seen what passion could build, and how swiftly it could destroy. She had served both queens and learned from each. From Catherine, dignity. From Anne, danger. And so she moved with care, the embodiment of humility, a woman who seemed to exist only to please, and yet, by doing so, began to reshape the court around her. She spoke of unity, of peace, of restoring order to a kingdom still bleeding from Anne's fall. And in her gentleness, Henry found absolution. The letters began again, but these were not the fevered declarations of a man undone. They were quiet promises, written in the tone of a man who believed he had at last found redemption. Jane did not resist when the crown was offered. She accepted it as though it were a prayer answered. Yet even in her triumph, the shadow of those before her lingered. The same courtiers who once whispered about Anne now whispered about her. "She is the peacemaker," they said, "the healer." But in the Tudor court, even virtue could be weaponized, for power never sleeps. It only changes its tone. For the first time in years the court exhaled. The arguments ceased. The sermons quieted. The king smiled again. Jane Seymour, Queen of England, had done what no woman before her could. She brought peace to a restless man. Her gentleness calmed him, Her silence soothed him. Where others had sought to rule his heart, she simply tended to it. And in that stillness, the realm began to mend. The courtiers adored her modesty, or rather, they found it convenient to adore. Her chambers were modest, her manner serene. She smiled where others had spoken, curtsied where others had questioned. But beneath that quiet exterior lived a sharp intuition. Jane knew how far favour could reach, and how quickly it could vanish. She had seen crowns made and unmade in the span of a single sigh, so she asked for little, save one thing. "A son," she prayed, "for England." And in the autumn of 1537, her prayer was answered. Edward, the long-awaited heir. Bells rang across London, bonfires lit the night. Henry wept, the tears of a man who believed his sins had finally been forgiven. But peace, in the Tudor court, was never meant to last. Within days, the Queen fell ill. The colour left her cheeks, the candles burned low, and as England rejoiced, Jane Seymour slipped quietly from the world she had tamed. The king was inconsolable. For all his wives, all his passions, and all his power, this was the one who left him with no anger, only grief. He called her his true queen, and in death she became what no mistress or rival had managed to be in life: untouchable. The woman who conquered a king, not by fire, but by stillness. The Queen of Peace. The court had grown quiet in the years since Jane's death. The king moved slower now. His eyes, once golden with fire, had dulled with age and ache. He spoke of faith and duty, but the man who had defied Rome and rewritten God's law still longed for something far simpler: to feel young again. And then, like magic, there she was, Catherine Howard, barely more than a girl, laughter like sunlight, eyes bright with mischief. She danced as if the world existed only for her, and for a time it did. The courtiers watched in silence as the king, heavy with years and memory, began to smile again. "A rose without thorns," he called her. She curtsied, blushing, unaware that no rose in the Tudor court ever bloomed without blood. Catherine was no strategist, no scholar, no reformer, but she was everything the court had forgotten how to be. Alive. She filled the long corridors with music and laughter, her presence a balm for the weary and a danger to the bored. And among those drawn to her light was Thomas Culpeper, handsome, reckless, and far too familiar with the language of temptation. Their eyes met first at a mask, a glance that lingered too long, a hand that brushed in passing. What began as whispers became risk. What began as youth became ruin. For in the Tudor court, secrets had walls but never doors. The courtiers who once praised her beauty began to murmur again, their smiles too sharp, their silences too long. Henry's love, once boundless, curdled into suspicion. He had aged, she had not, and in that cruel divide, her fate was sealed. When the charges came, adultery, betrayal, Catherine wept, pleaded and prayed, but innocence once again had no place in a kingdom built on desire. On a cold February morning, the young queen was led to the block, and there, before the end, she spoke softly, her voice steady, her eyes unflinching. "I die a queen," she said, "but I would rather have died the wife of Thomas Culpeper." A confession, a farewell, and perhaps the truest sentence of her life. The blade fell, and the court fell silent once more. For with Catherine Howard died not only another queen, but the last echo of passion in a kingdom that had burned itself out on love. Yet some say her laughter still lingers in the halls of Hampton Court. We'll revisit young Catherine soon enough, following that laughter back to where it all began. In the end, history remembers kings. But behind every crown, there are the women who touched it first. Quietly, dangerously, in the dark. Bessie Blunt, who gave the king his first son and learned that even love blessed by birth could not outlast favour. Mary Boleyn, whose laughter once filled the court, only to fade beneath the shadow of her sister's ambition. Anne, who turned desire into destiny, and paid for it with her head. Jane Seymour, gentle and brief, who gave the king his heir and vanished into sainthood. And Catherine Howard, youth itself, radiant, reckless, devoured by the very fire she awakened. They were called mistresses, but that word, simple, cruel, incomplete, cannot contain what they truly were. They were currencies of ambition, keepers of secrets, mirrors of power. They shaped alliances, inspired wars, and turned the whisper of a name into the fate of a nation. And when they fell, as all did, the court mourned not just their beauty, but the thrill of possibility they carried. For in Tudor England, power did not always wear a crown. Sometimes it wore silk. Sometimes it smiled across a table. Sometimes it whispered a promise in the dark. And when the candle burned low, when the music stopped and the courtiers drifted away, the stories of those women remained, lingering, like perfume in an empty room, from pillow to power, to ashes. But oh, how brightly they burned!